What's a thing that is dangerously close to collapse that you know about? Story 1. I'm a structural engineer, and there's one building that still keeps me up at night. It's an old high-rise in Chicago that I inspected a few years back. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Clean lobby, steady elevators, freshly painted walls. But the second I reviewed the foundation plans, my heart sank. The entire structure was built on compacted sand with minimal reinforcement. To make it worse, the drainage system around the building was practically non-existent. Water from years of rain and snow had eroded the soil underneath, creating voids big enough to fit a small car. When I ran my calculations, the safety margins were alarmingly low. One major storm or a minor earthquake could cause the whole thing to shift. I brought my findings to the building's management, and they shrugged it off. Their exact words were, "We're fully occupied, and tenants aren't complaining." I tried to explain that a collapse wouldn't just cost lives. It would bankrupt them in lawsuits. Still, they refused to act, saying, "We've got insurance for this kind of thing." I walked away knowing I did everything I could, but I can't help thinking about the people living there. They have no idea the walls around them are literally on borrowed time. Story 2. I used to work at a small-town amusement park, and there's this old wooden roller coaster we called the Widowmaker. It's been there since the 1950s, and it hasn't aged gracefully. The tracks are warped, the wood is rotting in places, and the bolts? Rusted beyond belief. Once, during an off-season inspection, I watched as one of the maintenance guys, barely paying attention, tightened the bolt with his bare hands. No tools, just his hand. That's how loose it was. During busy weekends, I'd hear customers screaming, not from the thrill but from the coaster lurching unpredictably. One guy even said his safety bar popped loose mid-ride. Management knew about all of it, but their solution was always, throw a fresh coat of paint on it and don't let inspectors get too close. I quit after one too many near misses, but I keep tabs on the park. Every time I see ads for that coaster, I wonder how long until it makes headlines for all the wrong reasons. Story 3. There's a dam about 10 miles from my hometown that's literally a disaster waiting to happen. Built in the 1940s, it was state-of-the-art back then, but it hasn't had a proper overhaul since the Carter administration. The cracks in the concrete are so bad you can see daylight through them in some places. During heavy rains, the water levels rise dangerously high, and locals start panic buying bottled water because we all know what's coming. What's even scarier is how much the local government downplays it. Every time someone brings up repairs, the county officials say, "It's not in the budget." Meanwhile, they're approving new housing developments right in the floodplain. Last year, an engineer went public with concerns, but they silenced him with legal threats. If that dam gives out, and it's not a question of if but when, thousands of people downstream are going to pay the price for decades of neglect. Edit. A lot of you are asking if I've tried reporting these issues to higher authorities. Trust me, I have. The problem is, bureaucracy moves slower than the disasters themselves. People in charge always think they have more time than they actually do. It's frustrating, but I hope enough voices can make a difference someday. Story 4. I used to work as a grocery store clerk, and let me tell you, the freezer section in that place is a ticking time bomb. There's this massive industrial freezer in the back that's been breaking down for years. Instead of replacing it, the management decided to fix it by jamming a cheap portable fan into the corner and calling it good. The condensation from the freezer constantly drips onto the floor, creating these massive ice puddles that we have to chip away at every morning. One time, I walked into the freezer to restock and found the temperature gauge flashing 50 degrees. It's supposed to stay at a solid 0. I reported it, and they just said, "Don't worry, it'll cool back down overnight." This wasn't a one-time thing either. It's been happening for years. What's even scarier is that they keep restocking raw meat and seafood in there. I honestly wouldn't eat anything from that store if my life depended on it. Story 5. My uncle works as a welder for a shipping company, and he once showed me a cargo ship that was barely seaworthy. This thing was a rust bucket, literally. He said the hull had so many patched over holes, it looked like Frankenstein's monster. The company's policy: patch it up, get it back on the water. No one wanted to spend the money to dry dock it for proper repairs. During one inspection, My uncle found a crack in the engine room bulkhead that was big enough to fit his hand through. He told his supervisor, and they said, "If it starts leaking, just pump the water out faster." The kicker? This ship regularly carried hazardous materials. Imagine what would happen if it sank near a major port. It's terrifying to think about, but they're still using that ship to this day. Story 6. There's an abandoned building in my city that's become a magnet for trouble. It's a 6-story warehouse that's been empty for decades, and it's practically falling apart. The windows are shattered, the floors are rotting, and the whole thing leans slightly to one side. The worst part? Teenagers love to sneak in there to hang out or explore. I can't blame them. It looks like something straight out of a horror movie. But it's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. A few years ago, part of the roof caved in during a snowstorm, and now there's a giant hole leading straight down to the basement. Despite the danger, no one's done anything about it. The city slapped a no trespassing sign on the front door and called it a day. Every time I see kids posting TikToks from inside, I feel sick to my stomach. It's not a question of if something happens, but when. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I've tried to contact the city about the abandoned warehouse. They told me it's private property, so there's not much they can do unless the owner takes action. The problem? The owner's been dead for years, and the property is tied up in legal limbo. It's beyond frustrating. Story 7. I live in a small town with a single water tower, and let me tell you, that thing is a disaster. The tower hasn't been repainted in decades, and the metal is rusting so badly that chunks occasionally fall off. A few years ago, a massive piece broke loose and smashed into a parked car. The town's solution? They put up a warning sign that says, "Stay clear of the water tower." What's worse is that this tower is the only source of drinking water for the entire town. Every time it rains, people report their water tasting funny, but the city insists it's safe to drink. I asked a friend who works in public health about it, and they said the tower should have been replaced years ago. It's only a matter of time before it completely fails, and I don't even want to think about what happens when it does. Story 8. A friend of mine is a firefighter, and he once showed me a fire escape on a local apartment building. That's basically a death trap. The thing is made of rusted iron, and the bolts holding it to the wall are barely hanging on. During a routine inspection, he tugged on one of the railings, and it came off in his hand. The scariest part? This building is fully occupied, and the fire escape is the only way out for some units. My friend reported it to the landlord, who shrugged and said, "If the tenants don't complain, it's not my problem." The fire department tried to fine him, but he fought it in court and won. Now, every time there's a fire alarm at that building. My friend says he's scared someone's going to fall to their death before they even make it out. Edit. To everyone asking about legal options, my firefighter friend said the laws are super outdated when it comes to fire escapes. Unless there's an actual injury or fatality, it's hard to force landlords to fix anything. It's messed up, but that's how it is. Story 9. My cousin works at a nuclear power plant, and he's told me some stuff that makes my hair stand on end. Apparently, they're still using equipment from the 1970s because the company refuses to upgrade. One time, a coolant pump failed and the backup pump didn't kick in because it hadn't been tested in years. They had to scramble to manually start it before the reactor overheated. The plant has had multiple near-miss events like that, but they always downplay them to the public. My cousin says it's only a matter of time before something serious happens. Every time I drive by that plant, I think about moving to another state. Story 10. There's a bridge in my state that's so dangerous it makes national news every few years. It's a massive suspension bridge built in the 1930s, and it's long overdue for repairs. Trucks regularly exceed the weight limit, and the vibrations from traffic have caused cracks to form in the support beams. The worst part? The bridge spans a major river, so if it ever collapses, it'll be catastrophic. A few years ago, engineers recommended closing it for repairs, but the state decided to keep it open because it's a vital transportation route. Now, every time I have to cross it, I grip the wheel and pray I make it to the other side. Edit. For those asking, yes, the bridge has been inspected recently, but the reports are always vague. They just say it's structurally deficient, but safe for travel, whatever that means. Story 11. I worked at a small airport for a couple of years, and let me tell you, the fuel tanks there are terrifying. These underground tanks were installed sometime in the 1960s and haven't been replaced since. During routine checks, we often found cracks in the tank linings, and one time there was a noticeable fuel leak. Management's response? Just patch it up. We can't afford to replace them. What's worse is that the tanks are located right next to a major water source for the area. Every time it rains, I worry about fuel seeping into the groundwater. The environmental risk is through the roof, but the airport doesn't seem to care. They're more focused on cutting costs than addressing the fact that a single major leak could poison the drinking water for thousands of people. Story 12. My friend is a mechanic at a bus depot, and he told me about one bus that literally should not be on the road. The brakes were failing intermittently, and the engine kept overheating during long routes. Instead of taking the bus out of service, the company told the drivers to just be extra cautious. They even painted over rust spots to make the bus look better for inspections. One day, my friend was asked to check it after the driver reported a loud bang during a trip. Turns out, a piece of the suspension had snapped, and the bus was operating on sheer luck. Management's solution? Weld it back together and keep it running. This bus is still in service, and every time I see it on the road, I feel a mix of fear and anger for the people riding it. Story 13. There's a theme park near my city, and the water rides are a lawsuit waiting to happen. The slides are old and poorly maintained, with cracks that have been crudely sealed with caulking. One slide in particular is notorious for injuring people. At least 5 riders have reported severe scrapes and bruises from sharp edges. The park's answer to complaints? It's a water ride. Minor injuries are part of the experience. They even stopped providing lifeguards at the bottom of the slides, saying it wasn't cost-effective. I went there last summer with my nephew, and the moment I saw the condition of the slides, I refused to let him ride. It's shocking that this place hasn't been shut down yet. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, I've reported these issues where I could. The problem is that a lot of these companies know how to work around inspections or delay actual fixes. It's frustrating, but they'll only act when something catastrophic happens, and by then, it's too late. Story 14. There's a hospital in my city that's holding on by a thread. My mom worked there as a nurse for 20 years before retiring, and she still hears stories from her old co-workers. The building itself is ancient, and the elevators constantly break down. One time, a patient had to be carried up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator got stuck mid-trip. Worse yet, the power grid for the hospital is outdated, and during a big storm last year, the backup generators failed. For 2 hours, staff had to manually operate critical equipment like ventilators. The hospital filed an incident report, but no real changes have been made. It's terrifying to think that this place is supposed to save lives, yet it's barely functioning. Story 15. I used to live near a massive railroad hub, and those trains are accidents waiting to happen. Many of the freight cars carry hazardous materials, like chemicals and flammable liquids, and a lot of them are decades old. You can hear the creaks and groans as the cars move, and sometimes you'll see loose bolts rattling as they pass. One night, there was a small derailment about a mile from my house. Luckily, it was just an empty car, but it left me wondering, what if it had been one carrying toxic chemicals? The rail company downplayed the incident, calling it routine, but I haven't been able to look at a passing train the same way since. Story 16. My cousin works at a local landfill, and he says the place is barely holding itself together. The landfill is completely over capacity, with piles of trash spilling out into nearby fields. The worst part? The company running it illegally buried barrels of industrial waste to save space. One day, during a rainstorm, the runoff created this nasty bubbling sludge that leaked into a nearby creek. My cousin told his boss, who just said, "Don't worry, nature will take care of it." The environmental damage is obvious, and nearby residents have even complained about mysterious health issues. Still, nothing has been done to address it. Edit. A lot of you are asking about whistleblower protections. Sadly, most people don't speak up because they're scared of losing their jobs. Even when reports are made, companies have legal teams ready to delay or dismiss investigations. It's a terrible cycle. Story 17. There's an old football stadium in my town that's in such bad shape it feels like it's going to collapse during every game. The bleachers are rusted, with visible cracks in the supports. During one high school game, a section of the stands shifted under the weight of the crowd, causing a full-blown panic. City officials promised repairs, but all they've done since then is slap on some warning signs. People still go to games, but I refuse to set foot in that stadium. It's just a matter of time before something truly disastrous happens. Story 18. I work for a construction company, and one project still haunts me. We were building a high-rise, and the developers insisted on using cheaper materials to save money. The steel beams were lower grade, and the concrete mix was so poor it started cracking during construction. When I raised concerns, my supervisor told me, "It's fine. Once it's painted, no one will notice." This building is now fully occupied, and every time I drive by, I feel guilty knowing the corners that were cut. One strong storm, and the whole thing could come down. Story 19. There's a local daycare that my friend's kid used to go to, and it's a nightmare. The building has faulty wiring, with exposed outlets sparking every time something's plugged in. During the summer, the air conditioning doesn't work, and the kids are left in sweltering rooms. What's even scarier is the fire exit situation. Half the doors are blocked by storage items, and the smoke detectors haven't been replaced in years. My friend pulled her kid out after seeing these conditions, but other parents don't seem to know, or they don't have other options. It's horrifying. Story 20. My local library is a beautiful old building, but it's falling apart. The roof leaks so badly that buckets are scattered around during rainstorms. The wiring is ancient, and sometimes the lights flicker ominously. What's worse is that the basement, where most of the archives are stored, floods every spring. Priceless historical documents are literally disintegrating, but the city says they don't have the budget to fix it. It's heartbreaking to see a place of knowledge being neglected like this. Edit. For those asking, yes, I've reported the stadium and daycare issues to the authorities. Unfortunately, a lot of these problems get tied up in bureaucracy, with no real solutions coming anytime soon. It's exhausting to watch these disasters in waiting just sit there, unchecked. Story 21. There's an old shopping mall in my town that's one strong windstorm away from becoming a pile of rubble. Half the stores are empty, and the management barely maintains the building. The roof leaks so badly that parts of the top floor are closed off, but you can still see buckets catching water in some of the hallways. Once I saw a piece of the ceiling fall during a rainstorm. It nearly hit a woman walking with her kid. The scariest part is the parking garage. It's dark, damp, and the concrete is crumbling everywhere. There are giant cracks in the support pillars, and water constantly drips through the ceiling. You can hear the creaking if you're parked for too long. The city has been trying to shut the place down for years, but the owners keep finding loopholes to keep it open. Honestly, I avoid the place completely now. Story 22. I used to work in a warehouse that stored chemicals, and let me tell you, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The storage units were ancient and improperly sealed, which meant fumes would sometimes leak into the main work area. Once, we had a spill of something they called non-hazardous, but it burned a hole straight through the floor. The manager's solution? Toss some kitty litter on it and call it a day. We had no real safety training, and half the fire extinguishers were expired. What's worse, the building itself was old and barely up to code. I remember hearing rats scurrying in the walls while handling chemicals labeled flammable. Every time I clocked in, I wondered if that day would be my last. Story 23. There's a highway overpass near my house that makes me nervous every time I drive under it. It was built in the 1970s and hasn't had any major repairs since. The concrete is visibly cracked, and there's rust eating away at the metal reinforcements. Last year, a chunk of concrete fell off and smashed into the hood of a car. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it was a wake-up call for the locals. The state keeps patching it up with quick fixes, But engineers have warned that the structure is beyond repair. The scary part? It's one of the busiest routes in the city, with thousands of cars passing over and under it daily. Every time I'm stuck in traffic beneath it, I can't help but think, is today the day it collapses? Edit. For everyone wondering why nothing's been done about these places, it almost always comes down to money. Companies and cities prioritize short-term savings over long-term safety, even if it puts people at risk. It's frustrating to watch, but that's the reality. Story 24. My neighbor works in IT for a hospital, and she told me their computer systems are hanging by a thread. The software they're using to manage patient records is so old that it doesn't even get updates anymore. Last year, a virus got into the system and wiped out an entire day's worth of data. Imagine trying to run a hospital without patient charts or medication schedules. Even scarier, the backup systems barely work. During a power outage, the servers went offline for hours because no one knew how to manually reboot them. My neighbor keeps warning the administration that they're risking lives, but they just tell her, "We'll look into it next quarter." It's a ticking time bomb. Story 25. There's a natural gas pipeline that runs through my town, and it's an absolute nightmare. It's over 50 years old, and maintenance is almost non-existent. Every few months you'll hear about a small leak somewhere along the line. The gas company always says it's under control, but then they evacuate entire neighborhoods as a precaution. A few years ago, there was a major rupture about 10 miles from here. The explosion leveled 2 houses and caused a massive fire. Since then, people have been pushing for the pipeline to be replaced, but the company says it's too costly. Meanwhile, we all live with the constant fear that it could happen again. Story 26. I used to work in a restaurant with a kitchen that should have been condemned. The ventilation system didn't work, so the whole place filled with smoke every night. The grease traps were never cleaned, and once, we had a fire because a pipe in the fryer literally burst into flames. The owner's response? Just make sure you have a fire extinguisher nearby. The health inspector came once and wrote a bunch of violations, but nothing really changed. I quit after seeing a rat run across the food prep area during dinner service. To this day, I won't eat out unless I know the restaurant has a good reputation. Edit. For those asking about accountability, it's shocking how easy it is for some places to avoid real consequences. A lot of businesses or government agencies just pay fines and keep going like nothing happened. It feels like no one cares until it's too late. Story 27. There's an amusement park in my state that operates a Ferris wheel that gives me chills every time I see it. It's over 60 years old, and the metal frame is visibly rusted. Last summer, the wheel got stuck for 3 hours with people still in the air. The park called it a technical glitch and gave everyone free tickets as compensation. What they didn't mention was that the safety locks on some of the gondolas are loose. My friend worked there briefly and said he saw one gondola swing open mid-ride. Management didn't even shut it down. They just told the workers to keep an eye on it. I can't believe people still get on that thing. Story 28. There's a small airport near me with a runway that's straight up dangerous. The asphalt is full of cracks and potholes, and there's no proper drainage system, so it floods every time it rains. Planes have had to abort landings because the surface is too slippery. A few months ago, a small plane skidded off the runway and into a fence. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the airport blamed it on pilot error. I've seen pilots take photos of the runway to send to the FAA, but nothing's been done. Honestly, it's a miracle there haven't been more accidents. Story 29. There's a public pool in my town that's practically a health hazard. The water filtration system hasn't worked properly in years, so the water often looks murky. A couple of kids got rashes after swimming there last summer, but the city just said it was unrelated. Even worse, the lifeguard chairs are so old and wobbly that one of them tipped over while a lifeguard was sitting in it. The city says they don't have the budget for repairs, but they keep selling pool passes like nothing's wrong. I won't let my kids anywhere near that place. Story 30. A friend of mine is a truck driver, and he told me about a shipping company that doesn't properly maintain its fleet. He was given a truck with bald tires and brakes that barely worked. When he reported it, his boss told him, Just drive slow and don't hit anything. One time the engine overheated while he was driving on the highway, and he had to pull over before it caught fire. The company refused to reimburse him for the repair costs, saying it was his fault for not checking the truck properly. He quit after that, but he says the company is still operating the same way. Edit. For everyone asking if these stories get reported, a lot of the time, people do report them. The problem is that enforcement is slow, and the penalties aren't severe enough to force real changes. It's a broken system that prioritizes money over safety. Story 31. There's an old hotel downtown that somehow manages to stay open despite being a complete hazard. The elevators are so unreliable that guests often get stuck for hours, and the staff just tells them, "Wait for maintenance." The plumbing is just as bad. Pipes regularly burst, flooding entire floors. One time, a guest's room was completely ruined when water started pouring through the ceiling, and the manager told them it was just normal wear and tear. What's even scarier is the fire safety, or lack thereof. The smoke detectors haven't worked in years, and the fire escape is rusted through in several places. The city issued fines multiple times, but the owners keep paying them off without fixing anything. It's like they're waiting for a tragedy to finally shut the place down. Story 32. My town has a small amusement pier, and the bumper cars are straight up dangerous. The car's electrical systems spark constantly, and a few weeks ago, one of them caught fire while a kid was driving it. Luckily, the staff put it out quickly, but instead of shutting the ride down, they just swapped out the car and kept going. The worst part? The track itself is warped and full of gaps. If the cars go too fast, they can actually bounce off the track entirely. I saw it happen once, and the staff just laughed it off, saying, "That's why we tell people to follow the rules." I haven't been back since, and I warn everyone I know to avoid that pier. Story 33. I used to live near a grain silo that was practically a death trap. The structure was over 80 years old and full of cracks, with rust covering most of the metal supports. During a storm, you could hear the entire thing creak and groan like it was about to collapse. Farmers still used it because it was cheaper than building a new one, even though everyone knew it wasn't safe. One day, part of the roof caved in, sending tons of grain spilling onto the ground. Thankfully, no one was inside at the time, but the damage cost thousands of dollars to clean up. The farmers just patched it up with sheet metal and kept using it like nothing happened. Every time I drive past it, I feel like I'm looking at an accident waiting to happen. Edit. For everyone asking why nothing is being done, it's the same story every time. Money and red tape. Whether it's a business owner or a local government, they're always more focused on short-term profits or avoiding liability than actually fixing the problem. It's beyond frustrating. Story 34. There's a community center in my neighborhood that's supposed to be a safe space for kids, but the building is falling apart. The roof leaks so badly that they have to close entire sections of the center whenever it rains. Last winter, the heating system broke down, and the kids had to wear their coats inside for weeks. The playground equipment is just as bad. Rusted swings, a slide with jagged edges, and a climbing frame that wobbles dangerously. The city keeps saying they don't have the funds to fix it, but they still promote the center like it's some amazing resource. Parents in the area are constantly raising money for repairs, but it's like putting a band-aid on a broken bone. Story 35. I worked at a factory that was one step away from a full-blown disaster. The machinery was ancient, with gears that jammed constantly and belts that snapped under pressure. During one shift, a worker's sleeve got caught in a conveyor belt, and the emergency stop didn't work. Thankfully, someone unplugged the machine just in time, but it left us all shaken. The factory also had a serious ventilation problem. Dust and fumes would build up so much that you could barely see across the room by the end of the day. Several workers developed breathing issues, but management dismissed it as seasonal allergies. I quit after a year because I couldn't take the constant risk of injury, or worse. Story 36. There's a ski resort a few hours from my city that's a complete mess. The chairlifts are so old that they jerk and sway dangerously in high winds. Last season, one of the lifts got stuck for over an hour, leaving skiers stranded in freezing temperatures. The staff's response? At least you had a good view. The trails aren't much better. Rocks and tree roots stick out everywhere because they don't groom them properly. Last year, a friend of mine hit a hidden rock and broke her wrist. The resort refused to take responsibility, saying, "Skiing is inherently risky." It's baffling that they're still in business. Edit. Some of you are asking about the role of inspections in these situations. The sad truth is, a lot of these places either fake their way through inspections or find loopholes to avoid them altogether. It's hard to hold anyone accountable when the system itself is broken. Story 37. There's a public parking garage downtown that should have been condemned years ago. The concrete beams are cracked, and rebar is exposed in multiple places. Water leaks through the ceiling, and during winter, icicles form and fall onto cars below. Last year, a section of the upper deck collapsed under the weight of a snowplow, damaging 3 cars. Instead of shutting it down, the city just blocked off the collapsed section and left the rest open. The worst part? People still park there because it's the cheapest option downtown. Every time I drive past, I wonder when the next section is going to give out. Story 38. I used to work for a petting zoo, and some of the enclosures were downright unsafe. The fences were so low that kids could easily climb over them, and the locks on the gates barely worked. One time, a goat escaped and ran into the picnic area, knocking over tables and scaring a toddler. The staff laughed it off, saying, "It's just a goat, what's the harm?" But the bigger concern was the larger animals, like the alpacas and donkeys. If one of them escaped, someone could get seriously hurt. Management refused to invest in better fencing, claiming it wasn't in the budget. I left because I didn't want to be there when something worse happened. Story 39. There's a school in my district that's in terrible shape. The ceilings have water stains everywhere, and one classroom even has a bucket in the corner to catch leaks. The playground is just as bad, with broken swings and a rusted slide that cuts kids' hands if they're not careful. The parents have been fighting for years to get funding for repairs, but the school board always says there's no money. Meanwhile, they spend thousands on new office furniture for the administration building. It's heartbreaking to see kids learning in such unsafe conditions. Story 40. A friend of mine works at a coal plant, and he says the place is barely holding itself together. The boilers are old and leak constantly, creating hotspots that could cause an explosion if left unchecked. The control systems are outdated too, and sometimes they glitch, leaving workers scrambling to manually adjust settings. The worst part? The management knows about all of this, but won't shut the plant down because it's one of the area's main power sources. My friend says every shift feels like a gamble, and he started looking for a new job because he doesn't want to be there when something goes horribly wrong. Edit. For everyone asking how these places get away with it, the answer is usually a combination of negligence, loopholes, and a lack of enforcement. Unless there's public outcry or a major incident, most of these problems stay under the radar. It's a sad reality, but it's the truth. Story 41. There's a train station in my city that's practically falling apart. The tracks are so old and misaligned that trains slow down to a crawl when they approach the platform. A few months ago, a passenger train derailed right outside the station because a section of the track had corroded. Thankfully, it was moving slowly, so no one was seriously hurt, but the damage was significant. The platform itself isn't much better. The concrete is crumbling, with rebar sticking out in some places. I once saw an elderly woman trip over a jagged edge and nearly fall onto the tracks. The city keeps promising upgrades, but all they've done so far is put up caution signs and tape off the worst sections. It's only a matter of time before something much worse happens. Story 42. I used to work at a brewery that had some of the most unsafe conditions I've ever seen. The fermentation tanks were old and leaking, and the pressure valves didn't work properly. One day, one of the tanks nearly exploded because the release valve got stuck. The entire staff had to evacuate while the brewmaster manually released the pressure. The floors were constantly wet and slippery because the drains were clogged half the time. Workers were falling left and right, but management just told us to wear better shoes. OSHA came by once and fined them for a few violations, but nothing really changed. I quit after seeing a coworker get third-degree burns from a steam pipe that burst without warning. Story 43. There's a small airport hangar near me that stores private planes, and the whole place looks like it's ready to collapse. The roof sags dangerously in the middle, and during heavy rain, water pours through the cracks, soaking everything inside. The electrical wiring is exposed in several places, and I've seen sparks fly when workers plug in equipment. The scariest part? The fuel storage tanks are right next to the hangar. If the roof ever gave way or there was an electrical fire, the whole place could go up in flames. The owner refuses to spend money on repairs, saying, "It's just a small operation. We don't need anything fancy." I don't know how this place hasn't been shut down yet. Edit. For those wondering why nothing is being done, it often comes down to a lack of oversight. Many small businesses or private operations don't face the same level of scrutiny as larger ones, so they get away with cutting corners. It's frustrating to watch. Story 44. There's a local factory that processes meat, and the conditions there are horrifying. The refrigeration units barely work, so raw meat often sits at unsafe temperatures for hours. The workers are forced to handle the meat with old, dull tools that frequently slip and cause injuries. One co-worker had to get stitches after slicing his hand open on a rusty blade. Even worse, the waste disposal system is broken, and piles of spoiled meat sit outside the factory, attracting rats and other pests. The smell is unbearable, and several workers have gotten sick from the unsanitary conditions. Management's response? Just wear masks if it bothers you. It's appalling that this place is still in operation. Story 45. There's an abandoned amusement park about an hour from my city, and it's a magnet for thrill seekers and urban explorers. The roller coasters are rusted and falling apart, and the Ferris wheel leans at an angle that looks ready to topple. A group of teenagers climbed the Ferris wheel last year for a dare, and one of the steps broke under their weight. The city has tried to block off access to the park, but the fencing is flimsy, and people find ways to sneak in. I worry that one day someone's going to get seriously injured, or worse, while exploring the ruins. It's like a ticking time bomb that no one wants to deal with. Story 46. I used to work at a daycare where the conditions were shockingly bad. The playground equipment was rusted and missing bolts, and the indoor play area had exposed nails sticking out of the walls. One day, a kid tripped on a loose carpet and hit their head on a broken toy. Instead of fixing anything, the owner just told us to keep an eye on the kids better. The worst part was the fire safety, or lack thereof. The smoke detectors didn't work, and the fire exits were blocked by storage boxes. When I brought it up to the owner, they laughed and said, "We've never had a fire, so it's fine." I quit after a few months because I couldn't handle the constant risk to the kids' safety. Edit. Some of you are asking why employees don't report these issues. In many cases, people are afraid of losing their jobs or facing retaliation. Even when reports are made, it can take months or even years for authorities to take action. Story 47. There's a local bridge that's used primarily by pedestrians and cyclists, and it's in terrible shape. The wooden planks are rotting, and a few of them have already broken through. People have started avoiding the center of the bridge because it feels like it could give out at any moment. The city put up warning signs but hasn't done any repairs. The worst part? The bridge spans a deep river, and if someone fell through, they could easily get hurt. Or worse. I stopped using it altogether after seeing a jogger nearly twist their ankle when a plank shifted under their weight. Story 48. There's a public library in my town that's supposed to be a historic landmark, but it's falling apart. The ceiling has massive water stains, and during heavy rains, water drips onto the bookshelves. One of the support beams has a visible crack running through it, but the city says repairs are too expensive. The wiring is ancient, and the lights flicker constantly. I heard from a librarian that they've had to shut the library down twice because of electrical fires. It's heartbreaking to see a place of learning in such a dangerous state, especially when it's supposed to be preserved for future generations. Story 49. There's a mall parking lot in my city that's notorious for sinkholes. A few years ago, one of the holes swallowed an entire car, and the mall management tried to blame it on natural causes. The truth is, the drainage system under the lot is completely broken, and every time it rains, the ground erodes a little more. Instead of fixing the issue, the mall just fills in the holes with dirt and gravel. It's only a temporary solution, and everyone knows it. I park as far from the mall as possible because I don't want to risk my car, or myself, falling into one of those pits. Story 50. There's a river dam near me that looks like it's ready to collapse. The concrete is cracked, and water leaks through in several places. During heavy rains, the river overflows, and the dam looks like it's about to buckle under the pressure. Engineers have warned that it needs immediate repairs, but the local government says they don't have the budget. The worst part? There's a small town downstream, and if the dam ever failed, it would be catastrophic. People have started moving away because they don't trust the dam to hold. But those who stay live in constant fear during storm season. Edit. A lot of you are asking if anything ever changes after incidents happen. Sadly, even when disasters occur, the response is often just more temporary fixes. Real change usually requires public outrage or lawsuits, and even then, it's a slow process. Story 51. There's a high school in my town that's in such bad shape, it feels like walking into a disaster zone. The ceiling tiles are missing in several classrooms, exposing wires and pipes. One hallway floods every time it rains because the roof hasn't been repaired in decades. Students have to walk through puddles to get to class, and some teachers even bring umbrellas inside to avoid getting soaked. The gymnasium is no better. The bleachers are rotting, and the basketball hoops are barely attached to the walls. Last year, part of the gym ceiling caved in during a pep rally, narrowly missing a group of students. The school board claims they don't have the funds for repairs, but somehow they always manage to find money for administrative bonuses. Story 52. I live near a power plant that's barely holding itself together. The cooling towers are rusted and leaking, and the plant has had several minor incidents over the years. Last summer, there was a small fire in one of the generator rooms because the wiring overheated. Instead of shutting down for proper maintenance, the plant stayed operational, claiming it was safe enough. The scariest part is that the plant is located near a densely populated area. If something major ever went wrong, it could impact thousands of people. Local activists have been pushing for an inspection, but the plant's owners keep lobbying against stricter regulations. It's like they're waiting for a catastrophe before taking any action. Story 53. There's a theme park ride near me that gives me chills every time I see it. It's one of those spinning pendulum rides, and it looks like it's barely holding together. The metal frame creaks loudly during every swing, and rust covers most of the joints. Last year, one of the hydraulic arms failed mid-ride, leaving people stuck at a terrifying angle for nearly an hour. The park's solution? They slapped a fresh coat of paint on it and reopened the ride a week later. I've seen maintenance workers inspecting the ride with nothing more than a flashlight and a wrench. It's horrifying to think that people trust their lives to something so poorly maintained. Edit. For those asking why these issues aren't fixed, it often comes down to profits. Places like schools, power plants, and amusement parks prioritize cutting costs over safety. Until something tragic happens, they don't feel the pressure to act. Story 54. There's a small airport near my town with one of the most dangerous runways I've ever seen. The asphalt is cracked and uneven, and during the winter it becomes an ice rink because there's no proper de-icing equipment. Pilots have to rely on sheer luck to land safely. A few months ago, a small plane skidded off the runway and into a ditch. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the airport blamed it on pilot error, rather than addressing the condition of the runway. Locals have been demanding repairs for years, but the airport insists they don't have the budget. It's only a matter of time before something worse happens. Story 55. There's an old church in my city that's been turned into a community center, but the building is falling apart. The walls are cracking, and the foundation is sinking so badly that doors don't close properly anymore. During one event, a piece of plaster fell from the ceiling and nearly hit a child. The basement, where most of the community programs are held, floods every spring. Mold is growing everywhere, and people have started complaining about respiratory issues after spending time there. Despite this, the city keeps using the building because they say there's no alternative. It's heartbreaking to see such an important community space in such disrepair. Story 56. I used to work at a car dealership, and some of the cars they sold were dangerously unsafe. One time, a car came in with faulty brakes. and instead of fixing them properly, the manager told the mechanic to just bleed the lines and hope for the best. That car was sold the next day. Another car had a cracked frame, which made it structurally unsound. The dealership patched it up with welding and sold it as like new. I reported these issues to the owner, but they told me, if the customer doesn't notice, it's not a problem. I quit soon after because I couldn't stand being part of something so unethical. Edit. A lot of you are asking why employees don't blow the whistle more often. The sad truth is that many people fear losing their jobs or facing legal retaliation. It's not always easy to speak up, even when lives are at risk. Story 57. There's a marina near my city with docks that are falling apart. The wood is rotting, and some of the planks are so loose that they bounce when you walk on them. Last year, a section of one dock collapsed, sending 2 people into the water. Thankfully, they weren't hurt, but the marina still hasn't repaired it properly. The electrical system is just as bad. The wiring for the boat hookups is old and exposed, and I've seen sparks fly when people plug in their boats. The marina's owner refuses to invest in upgrades, saying it's too expensive. It's a miracle that no one has been seriously injured yet. Story 58. There's a daycare in my neighborhood that's supposed to be a safe space for kids, but the conditions are horrifying. The playground is full of broken equipment, including swings with rusted chains and a slide with jagged edges. Inside, the walls have peeling paint, and there are exposed wires near the play area. Last year, a child got hurt when a piece of furniture tipped over because it wasn't secured to the wall. The daycare's response? Kids will be kids. Parents have started pulling their children out, but many don't have other options. It's heartbreaking to see families stuck in such a dangerous situation. Story 59. There's a mall in my town with an escalator that's been malfunctioning for years. It jerks violently when you step on it, and the handrails often stop moving halfway up. Last month, a woman tripped and fell because of the sudden stop, and she ended up breaking her wrist. The mall's management keeps saying they're waiting on parts to fix it, but it's been like this for years. People still use it because the elevators are slow and unreliable. I avoid the mall entirely now because I don't trust the safety of anything there. Story 60. I once worked at a grocery store with a walk-in freezer that was a death trap. The door latch was broken, so it would sometimes lock people inside. We had to keep a crowbar nearby to pry it open when that happened. One time, a co-worker got stuck for 20 minutes before someone heard them banging on the door. The freezer also had massive icicles hanging from the ceiling, and one of them fell and nearly hit me. I reported these issues to the manager, but they just shrugged and said, "It's not in the budget to fix it." I quit soon after because I didn't feel safe working there. Edit. For everyone asking about regulations, many of these places technically pass inspections because they know how to temporarily hide the worst issues. It's a broken system that prioritizes profits over people's safety. Story 61. There's a subway station in my city that's practically falling apart. The stairs leading to the platform are cracked and uneven, and the handrails are so loose they wobble when you grab them. During the winter, ice builds up on the stairs because the heating system for the entrance hasn't worked in years. Last year, a man slipped and broke his leg, and the station still hasn't made any repairs. The worst part is the platform itself. The tiles are cracked, and chunks of concrete have fallen off the edges. One time, I saw a section of the platform crumble when a train arrived, sending debris onto the tracks. The transit authority keeps promising upgrades, but all they've done so far is add warning signs. It feels like they're waiting for a major accident before taking action. Story 62. There's a landfill near my town that's so poorly managed, it's a disaster waiting to happen. The containment liners are old and torn, which means toxic waste is seeping into the surrounding soil and groundwater. A nearby creek has started to show signs of contamination. Dead fish, foul odors, but the landfill's owners deny any responsibility. The worst part is the methane buildup. The landfill hasn't installed proper ventilation, so gas pockets form beneath the surface. Last year, one of these pockets exploded, sending debris flying into a nearby field. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the explosion caused a fire that burned for days. Locals have been demanding better oversight, but the company keeps ignoring them. Story 63. There's a nursing home in my city that's in terrible condition. The building is old and hasn't been properly maintained, with peeling paint, broken windows, and a roof that leaks every time it rains. The heating and cooling systems barely work, so residents are left freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer. The staff is just as overburdened as the building. There aren't enough caregivers, so residents are often left unattended for hours. Last year, an elderly woman fell out of her wheelchair because no one was around to help her. When her family complained, the administration blamed staff shortages and did nothing to fix the problem. It's heartbreaking to see vulnerable people treated this way. Edit. For those asking why these issues aren't being addressed, the answer is often a lack of accountability. Whether it's private businesses or public institutions, they can delay real fixes for years unless there's intense public pressure or legal action. Story 64. There's an overpass near my house that's so dangerous, I avoid driving under it entirely. The concrete is crumbling, and rebar is sticking out in multiple places. Last summer, a chunk of concrete fell onto a car, smashing the windshield. Thankfully, the driver wasn't seriously hurt, but the city just closed off one lane and called it a temporary fix. What's even scarier is that this overpass is part of a major highway. Trucks and heavy vehicles pass over it constantly, adding more stress to the already weak structure. Engineers have recommended shutting it down for a complete rebuild, but the state says it doesn't have the budget. Every time I see it, I wonder when it's finally going to collapse. 65. There's a carnival that comes to my town every year, and the rides are terrifying. The workers set them up in just a few hours, and you can see them hammering parts together like they're building a Lego set. One year, I rode the Ferris wheel, and the seatbelt didn't latch properly. When I told the operator, he just said, "Hold on tight." Another ride, the spinning swings, actually came loose while people were on it. The swings dropped about 6 feet before the ride stopped, and a few people were injured. The carnival always leaves town before anyone can hold them accountable, and yet people still flock to the rides every year. Story 66. I used to work at a fast food restaurant with a kitchen that should have been condemned. The fryers were so old that oil leaked onto the floor, making it slippery and dangerous. One day, a co-worker slipped and grabbed onto a hot grill to break their fall, suffering second-degree burns. The ventilation system was equally bad. Smoke and grease built up so much that it triggered the fire alarm multiple times a week. Instead of fixing anything, the manager just told us to work faster so the smoke clears quicker. I quit after a few months because I couldn't stand the constant safety risks. Edit. A lot of people are asking if inspections ever catch these problems. The sad reality is that many places know when inspections are coming and temporarily fix or hide the worst issues. It's a broken system that lets bad actors slip through the cracks. Story 67. There's a community pool in my town that's so poorly maintained, it's a health hazard. The filtration system barely works, so the water is always cloudy and smells like chlorine and mildew. Last summer, several kids got ear infections after swimming there, but the city denied any connection to the pool. The decking around the pool is just as bad. The tiles are cracked and uneven, and one kid cut their foot so badly they needed stitches. Instead of fixing the deck, the city just put up caution tape and told people to watch their step. It's shocking that the pool is still open. Story 68. There's a storage facility near me with conditions so bad, it's a miracle nothing serious has happened yet. The ceiling leaks, the walls are covered in mold, and the doors don't lock properly. Last winter, a section of the roof collapsed under the weight of snow, damaging several storage units. The owner refused to compensate customers for the damages, claiming it was an act of God. People have started moving their belongings elsewhere, but the facility is still operating. Every time I drive by, I see fewer cars in the parking lot, but somehow, they're still in business. Story 69. There's an old dam near my hometown that's an absolute disaster waiting to happen. The spillway is cracked and can't handle heavy rainfall, so water often overtops the dam during storms. Last year there was a near miss when the river flooded, and the dam barely held. Engineers have warned for years that the structure needs to be replaced, but local officials keep kicking the can down the road. The dam is upstream from several towns, and if it ever fails, the damage would be catastrophic. It's terrifying to think about, especially during storm season. Story 70. I used to work at a call center in an office building that was falling apart. The ceiling tiles were stained and sagging, and one of them actually fell onto a co-worker's desk during a meeting. The wiring was just as bad. Outlets sparked whenever we plugged in our computers, and the lights flickered constantly. The elevators were even worse. They broke down so often that we had to take the stairs most days. One time, a group of people got stuck for over an hour before maintenance could get them out. Management's response? These things happen. I quit after a few months because I couldn't stand working in such an unsafe environment. Edit. For everyone asking why these places aren't shut down, it's often because the rules and regulations are so loosely enforced. Many places are only inspected after a major incident, and by then, the damage is already done. 71. There's a playground in my neighborhood that's downright dangerous. The jungle gym is rusted and wobbles if more than one kid climbs on it. The swings are attached to chains that have started fraying, and the slide has sharp edges where the plastic has cracked. Last summer, a kid got cut so badly on the slide that they needed stitches. The ground underneath the equipment is another problem. Instead of soft padding or sand, it's just uneven dirt and rocks. If a child falls, they're likely to get seriously hurt. The city keeps saying they'll fix it next year, but nothing ever happens. Parents have started avoiding the park entirely, and now it just sits there, falling further into disrepair. Story 72. There's an old office building downtown that should have been condemned years ago. The windows are cracked and barely hold together during storms. One time, a strong wind shattered one of the windows, sending glass flying onto the street below. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it could have easily been a tragedy. The interior is just as bad. The HVAC system hasn't worked in years, so it's freezing in the winter and unbearably hot in the summer. The elevators are out of service more often than not, and the stairwells are poorly lit, making them a safety hazard. Tenants have complained for years, but the landlord refuses to spend money on repairs, claiming the building is too historic to renovate. Story 73. There's a water tower in my town that looks like it's about to collapse. The metal supports are rusted, and you can see giant holes in the tank where the paint has peeled away. Every time there's a strong wind, the whole structure sways visibly. What's worse is that this tower provides drinking water for most of the town. During the summer, the water often comes out brown, and the city claims it's just harmless sediment. Locals have been demanding a replacement for years, but the city keeps saying it's not a priority. Every time I drive past it, I wonder if it's going to fall over. Edit. For everyone asking, yes, locals have tried to report these issues to authorities. The problem is, government and property owners often drag their feet, citing budget constraints or historical preservation laws. It's frustrating to see nothing change. Story 74. There's a hiking trail near me with a suspension bridge that's a total death trap. The cables are frayed, and the wooden planks are so rotted that they bend under your weight. Last year, one of the planks snapped while someone was crossing, and they fell into the shallow creek below. Luckily, they only had minor injuries, but it could have been much worse. The park rangers have put up signs warning people to use caution, but the bridge remains open. What's worse is that it's a popular spot for families and kids. I avoid the trail entirely now because I don't trust that bridge to hold up much longer. Story 75. I used to work at a car rental company with a fleet of vehicles that were barely roadworthy. Many of the cars had bald tires, worn-out brakes, and cracked windshields. One time, a customer brought a car back because the steering wheel locked up while they were driving. Instead of fixing it, the manager just put the car back on the lot. Another car had an issue with the airbags. They didn't deploy during a minor collision. When I reported it, the response was, well, they signed a waiver. I quit after realizing the company didn't care about customer safety. To this day, I warn people to avoid renting from them. Story 76. There's an apartment building in my city that's so poorly maintained, it's hard to believe people live there. The fire alarms don't work, and the emergency exits are either blocked or locked. Last year, a small kitchen fire spread to 3 units because the sprinklers didn't activate. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but the damage was extensive. The plumbing is just as bad. Pipes burst regularly, flooding apartments and hallways. The landlord refuses to make repairs, claiming that tenants should be grateful for affordable rent. Some residents have moved out, but others have no choice but to stay. It's a horrible situation. Edit. For those wondering why tenants or customers don't take legal action, many are afraid of retaliation or can't afford to fight back. It's an uphill battle, especially when the system seems to favor those in power. Story 77. There's a construction site near my house that's a safety nightmare. The workers don't wear proper gear, and scaffolding is often left unsecured. One day, a section of scaffolding collapsed, injuring 2 workers. Instead of halting construction to investigate, the site manager just told the crew to be more careful. The equipment is outdated and poorly maintained. I've seen cement mixers leaking oil and cranes making strange noises while lifting heavy loads. It's terrifying to think about what could happen if something goes wrong. I avoid walking near the site because I don't trust it to be safe. Story 78. There's a local community theater that's literally falling apart. The seats are so old that the springs poke through the cushions, and several of the rows are roped off because the floor underneath them is unstable. During a performance last year, a chunk of the ceiling plaster fell onto the stage, narrowly missing the actors. The backstage area is even worse. The wiring is outdated, and the lights flicker constantly. The fire exits are blocked by old props and set pieces, making them nearly impossible to use in an emergency. The theater board says they don't have the money for repairs, but they continue to sell tickets like nothing's wrong. Story 79. There's a gym in my town that should have been shut down years ago. The machines are rusted and break down frequently, and the floors are covered in cracks and loose tiles. Last month, someone tripped while running on a treadmill because the belt slipped. They ended up with a broken arm. The locker rooms are no better. The showers don't drain properly, so there's always standing water on the floor, and mold covers the walls. Despite all this, the gym still charges premium prices and even advertises itself as state-of-the-art. It's ridiculous. Story 80. I used to work at a retail store with a stockroom that was a complete hazard. The shelves were overloaded, and boxes were stacked so high they often toppled over. One time, a co-worker was nearly crushed when a stack of heavy boxes fell. The manager's response? Just be more careful next time. The stockroom also had exposed wiring and a leaky ceiling. During one storm, water dripped onto the electrical panel, causing a small fire. The fire department shut us down for a day, but the store reopened without fixing anything. I quit soon after because I didn't feel safe working there. Edit. For those asking about inspections and regulations, a lot of these places find ways to hide their problems during inspections or delay necessary fixes. It's a frustrating cycle that often only gets addressed after something goes horribly wrong. Story 81. There's a diner in my town that's been around forever, but the kitchen is an absolute horror show. The grease traps haven't been cleaned in what looks like years, and the entire place smells like burnt oil. One time, I saw a cockroach crawl across the counter while I was waiting for my order. The staff didn't even flinch. They just wiped it away like it was no big deal. The refrigeration units are barely working. Food often sits out for hours before being put away, and I overheard a waitress once say, "Just scrape off the mold, they won't notice." The health department has fined them multiple times, but they somehow keep their doors open. I stopped eating there after getting food poisoning, and now I tell everyone I know to avoid the place. Story 82. There's an old rail bridge near my city that's a disaster waiting to happen. The supports are rusted through, and the wooden ties are so rotted that you can see daylight between them. Freight trains pass over it daily, carrying heavy loads of coal and other materials. Last year, a train partially derailed because one of the ties gave way. Thankfully, the cars were empty, but the bridge was closed for weeks while they made temporary repairs. Engineers have been warning about the bridge's condition for years, but the railroad company claims it's still within acceptable limits. Every time I drive under it, I can't help but hold my breath. Story 83. There's a hospital in my city that's barely functional. The emergency room is so overcrowded that patients often wait hours, or even days for a bed. The medical equipment is outdated, with monitors that beep randomly, and IV pumps that sometimes stop working mid-treatment. The building itself is just as bad. The plumbing constantly backs up, flooding patient bathrooms and hallways. Last winter, the heating system broke down, and patients were given blankets to stay warm. The staff does their best, but they're clearly overwhelmed. It's terrifying to think about needing serious care in a place like that. Edit. A lot of people are asking why places like this aren't shut down. The answer is usually politics and bureaucracy. Whether it's a diner, bridge, or hospital, it often takes years of complaints, or a tragedy, before anything gets done. Story 84. There's a ski resort near me with a chairlift that's a total hazard. The cables are frayed, and the chairs sway dangerously even on calm days. Last season, a chair detached from the cable, sending 2 skiers plummeting into the snow below. Thankfully, they weren't seriously hurt, but the resort called it a rare equipment malfunction. The trails aren't much better. Rocks and tree stumps are left exposed because they don't bother grooming properly. A friend of mine broke their ankle after hitting a hidden tree root. Despite all this, the resort still markets itself as world-class. I've stopped going there because it's just not worth the risk. Story 85. I used to work at a clothing store with a ceiling that leaked constantly. During rainstorms, water would pour through the roof and soak the inventory. The solution? Buckets everywhere. One time, a customer slipped on a puddle and sprained their ankle, and the manager told us to just mop faster next time. The stockroom was even worse. The shelves were unstable and overloaded, and one of them collapsed while I was grabbing a box. Luckily, I wasn't hurt, but it scared the life out of me. I quit after realizing the company didn't care about the safety of its employees or its customers. Story 86. There's a daycare near me that's so poorly run, it's shocking they're still in business. The playground equipment is falling apart, with rusted monkey bars and swings that barely hold together. Inside, the carpets are stained and smell like mildew, and the toys are old and broken. One time, a child got their finger stuck in a broken toy, and the staff didn't even notice until another parent pointed it out. When parents complain, the daycare just blames budget constraints. It's heartbreaking because some families don't have other options. Edit. For those asking why more parents don't report places like this, it's often because they feel stuck. Affordable childcare is hard to find, and some families don't have the time or money to fight back. It's an impossible situation for many. Story 87. There's a warehouse near my house that stores chemicals, and the conditions are terrifying. The barrels are stacked haphazardly, and some of them are leaking. One time, I saw workers mopping up a green liquid without gloves or masks. The building itself is just as bad. The walls are cracked, and the roof leaks during storms, mixing rainwater with the chemicals. The company claims they follow all safety regulations, but I've never seen an inspector on site. It's scary to think about what could happen if something went wrong. Story 88. There's a community swimming pool in my town that's barely usable. The water is murky, and the filtration system hasn't worked in years. The tiles around the pool are cracked and slippery, and one kid broke their arm after falling last summer. The lifeguards are clearly undertrained and spend more time on their phones than watching the pool. Despite this, the city keeps selling memberships and calling it a family-friendly facility. Most parents have stopped bringing their kids, but the pool is still open for anyone willing to risk it. Story 89. There's an apartment building downtown with a fire escape that's a total death trap. The stairs are rusted through, and one of the landings collapsed a few months ago. Thankfully, no one was on it at the time, but the building owner still hasn't fixed it. The interior isn't much better. The elevators break down constantly, and the hallways are so poorly lit that tenants have tripped on loose floorboards. The building is technically rent-controlled, so many residents can't afford to move elsewhere. It's heartbreaking to see people stuck in such unsafe conditions. Story 90. I used to work at a bakery that was a complete mess behind the scenes. The ovens were so old they would randomly shut off mid-bake, and the freezers barely kept things cold enough to meet health standards. One time, I found mold growing on a batch of dough, and the manager just told me to cut off the bad parts. The floors were slippery from constant spills, and one of my co-workers broke their wrist after slipping during a rush. When we brought it up to the owner, they just shrugged and said, "Accidents happen." I quit soon after because I couldn't handle the constant stress of working in such unsafe conditions. Edit. A lot of people are asking if inspections would help. The problem is that many of these places know how to look good just long enough to pass inspections. It's frustrating to see safety take a backseat to profits. Story 91. There's a gas station near my house with underground fuel tanks that are well past their expiration date. The pavement above the tanks is cracked and sinking, which makes me think the tanks themselves are corroding. A few years ago, there was a small spill when a pump malfunctioned, and the smell of gasoline lingered for days. The worst part is that this station is right next to a residential neighborhood. If those tanks ever fail, the contamination could spread to the groundwater. Locals have reported the issue to environmental agencies, but the station keeps operating, claiming their tanks meet safety standards. Every time I fill up there, I wonder if it's worth the risk. Story 92. There's a bridge near my city that's a disaster waiting to happen. The metal supports are rusted through, and the surface is covered in potholes that make driving across it feel like an obstacle course. Last winter, a truck's tire got stuck in one of the holes, causing a major traffic jam. Engineers have warned that the bridge needs immediate repairs, but the local government says it doesn't have the funds. Meanwhile, they keep approving heavier trucks to use the route. Every time I drive over it, I keep my windows down, just in case I need to make a quick escape. Story 93. I used to work at a pet store where the conditions for the animals were horrifying. The cages were so overcrowded that animals were constantly fighting, and some were injured as a result. The fish tanks were rarely cleaned, and several fish would die every week because of poor water quality. The store's solution? Throw the dead ones in the trash and restock. One time I saw a hamster with a broken leg, and the manager told me to just put it in the back until it's gone. I quit after a few months because I couldn't stand the neglect. To this day, I only support small, ethical pet shops. Edit. A lot of people are asking why places like this aren't shut down. The truth is, enforcement is often reactive rather than proactive. Unless someone files a formal complaint, these problems usually go unnoticed. It's frustrating and heartbreaking. Story 94. There's a hotel in my town that's in such bad shape, it feels like it belongs in a horror movie. The carpets are stained, the walls are covered in peeling wallpaper, and the plumbing is so old that the water comes out brown half the time. Guests often complain about the smell of mildew, but management just blames it on the age of the building. The elevators are terrifying. One of them got stuck between floors last year with a family inside, and it took over an hour to get them out. Instead of fixing the problem, the hotel just posted signs that say, "Use elevators at your own risk." I tell everyone I know to stay far away from that place. Story 95. There's a carnival that sets up in my town every summer, and the rides are beyond sketchy. One of the roller coasters has visible cracks in the tracks, and the seats are so loose they rattle during the ride. Last year, a bolt came loose while the ride was in motion, and the operators just stopped it, tightened the bolt, and reopened it 10 minutes later. The food stalls aren't much better. The grills are filthy, and I once saw a worker drop a hot dog on the ground, pick it up, and serve it anyway. Despite all this, the carnival is packed every year because it's the only entertainment in town. I refuse to go anymore. It's just not worth the risk. Story 96. There's a local gym with equipment so outdated it feels like stepping back into the 1980s. The treadmills are jerky and often stop mid-run, which has caused several people to fall. The weights are rusty, and some of the benches are so unstable, they wobble when you sit on them. The locker rooms are no better. The showers don't drain properly, and the floors are covered in mold. Last month, someone slipped and hit their head on the sink, and the gym just put up a wet floor sign instead of fixing the problem. I canceled my membership after seeing the state of the place. It's just not safe. Edit. For those asking if these places are ever inspected, they usually are, but inspections are often too infrequent to catch ongoing issues. Many businesses know how to temporarily fix things to pass an inspection, only to let everything fall apart afterward. Story 97. There's a parking garage in my city that's an accident waiting to happen. The concrete beams are crumbling, and chunks of the ceiling have fallen onto cars more than once. The lighting is terrible, and half the security cameras don't even work. The garage is always packed because it's the cheapest option downtown, but every time I park there, I worry about my car or myself. Last month, a woman tripped on a broken stair in the stairwell and ended up with a sprained ankle. The owners still haven't fixed the stairs. They just put up a sign that says, "Watch your step." Story 98. There's a small airport near my town with runways that are so cracked and uneven, they're dangerous to land on. During heavy rain, water pools in the cracks, making it even more hazardous. Last year, a small plane skidded off the runway because the brakes couldn't grip on the wet surface. The airport insists that repairs are in the works, but it's been years with no progress. Pilots who fly there frequently have started avoiding it altogether, but it's the only option for some private flyers. Every time I see a plane land there, I hold my breath. Story 99. There's a construction site near my house with no regard for safety. Workers don't wear helmets or harnesses, and debris is constantly falling onto the sidewalks below. A few months ago, a piece of scaffolding fell onto a parked car, smashing the windshield. The site has been reported multiple times, but the developers always claim they're addressing the issues. Meanwhile, construction continues as if nothing's wrong. I've started crossing the street whenever I walk past because I don't trust it to be safe. Story 100. There's a daycare near me that's so understaffed, it's a miracle no child has been seriously hurt. One caregiver is often left to watch over 15 or more kids at once, which means accidents go unnoticed until it's too late. Last month, a child fell off a chair and hit their head, and it took several minutes before anyone realized what happened. The building itself is falling apart. The windows are cracked, the heating barely works in the winter, and the playground is full of broken equipment. Parents keep complaining, but the daycare says they can't afford to hire more staff or make repairs. It's heartbreaking to see families stuck in such a dangerous situation. Edit. For those asking if legal action can fix these issues, it's often complicated. Lawsuits can take years, and not every family or individual has the resources to fight back. It's a system that frequently leaves people in unsafe conditions. Story 101. There's an abandoned factory in my town that's a hotspot for thrill seekers and urban explorers, but it's unbelievably dangerous. The floors are rotted through in many places, and you can see straight down to the basement. A few months ago, a group of teenagers went in, and one of them fell through a hole in the floor, breaking their leg. The building is filled with old machinery, rusted beams, and exposed wiring. The city keeps putting up "no trespassing" signs, but people ignore them because the factory has a creepy, adventurous vibe. It's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. Or worse. The city has talked about demolishing it, but nothing ever happens. Story 102. There's a riverfront boardwalk near my city that's falling apart. The wooden planks are warped and splintered, and you can feel the whole thing sway if too many people are walking on it at once. Last year, a section of the boardwalk collapsed during a festival, and a few people fell into the river. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but the incident barely made the news. The city's solution was to rope off the damaged section and put up some warning signs. The rest of the boardwalk is still open, even though it's just as unsafe. Locals avoid it now, but tourists still flock there, unaware of the risks. Every time I see people walking on it, I can't help but cringe. Story 103. There's a college dorm in my town that's in such bad shape, it's hard to believe students live there. The pipes burst regularly, flooding rooms and hallways. The ceilings have massive water stains, and in one room, the ceiling caved in completely after a storm. The students had to move out temporarily, but the university just patched the ceiling and told them to move back in. The elevators are just as bad. They break down frequently, trapping students inside for hours. Last year, the fire alarms malfunctioned, and the entire building had to be evacuated because of smoke from a minor kitchen fire. The university says they're planning renovations, but no one knows when, or if, they'll actually happen. Edit. For everyone asking about liability, places like this often get away with it because students, tourists, or tenants don't have the resources to push back. It's frustrating, but the system favors the ones in power. Story 104. There's a small amusement park near me that runs an old wooden roller coaster. The structure creaks loudly with every turn, and you can see the wood splintering in some areas. A few years ago, a piece of the track came loose, and the ride had to be stopped halfway through. The park called it routine maintenance and reopened the ride the next day. The seats are no better. The lap bars barely lock in place, and you can feel them shift during the ride. I've stopped going to the park altogether because I just don't trust that coaster, or any of their other rides, to be safe. It's amazing they haven't been shut down yet. Story 105. There's a trucking company near me with vehicles that are barely roadworthy. The trucks have bald tires, cracked windshields, and brakes that fail regularly. Last year, one of their trucks lost control on a hill and crashed into a ditch. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but it could have been much worse. The company's solution? They slapped some new paint on the trucks to make them look better, but nothing was done about the actual mechanical issues. Drivers have complained about the safety risks, but the company just tells them to drive carefully. I avoid driving near their trucks whenever I see them on the road. Story 106. There's a nursing home in my city that's horrifyingly understaffed. The residents are often left unattended for hours, and the staff is so overwhelmed they can barely keep up with basic care. A friend of mine who worked there said she once found a resident sitting in their wheelchair with bed sores because they hadn't been moved in days. The building itself is just as bad. The heating system barely works, and during a snowstorm last winter, several rooms dropped below freezing. The administration claimed it was an unforeseen issue, but it's clear they're cutting corners to save money. Families have started pulling their loved ones out, but many don't have other options. Edit. For those wondering why inspections don't catch these issues, many facilities know how to prepare for them. They clean up and fix things temporarily, only to let them deteriorate again once the inspectors leave. It's a broken system. Story 107. There's a public park in my town with a pond that's supposed to be a nice feature, but it's horribly polluted. Trash and oil slicks cover the surface, and the water smells awful, especially in the summer. Last year, a dog got sick after drinking from the pond, and a local vet said it was probably due to toxins in the water. The city occasionally sends workers to clean it up, but they never address the root of the problem: stormwater runoff from nearby roads and businesses. People still visit the park, but most avoid the pond entirely. It's sad to see a once beautiful place turned into such a mess. Story 108. There's a car wash near me that's practically falling apart. The conveyor belt often stops working, leaving cars stranded mid-wash. The brushes are so old they've started falling apart, scratching the paint on cars. A friend of mine went through it and ended up with a cracked side mirror because one of the brushes got stuck. The owner refuses to make upgrades, claiming the car wash still gets the job done. The waiting area isn't much better. It's full of broken chairs and smells like mildew. I've stopped going there because I'd rather wash my car by hand than risk damaging it. Story 157. There's a diner near my house that's been around for decades, but the kitchen is a disaster. The grease traps are so full they spill over, and the ventilation system doesn't work, so the entire place smells like burnt oil. Last year, a small fire broke out because of the grease buildup, but the owner just had the staff clean up and reopen the next day. The food storage is just as bad. The refrigerators don't keep a consistent temperature, and I've seen staff serve food that's clearly gone bad. I stopped eating there after getting food poisoning, and I warn everyone I know to stay away. Story 158. There's a hardware store in my town with shelves that are so overloaded they're a hazard. One time I saw an entire display of paint cans topple over because the shelves weren't secured properly. A customer was nearly hit, but managed to jump out of the way just in time. The back storage area is even worse. The floors are covered in debris, and the staff has to climb unstable ladders to reach inventory. I don't know how the place passes inspections, but it feels like a disaster waiting to happen. I avoid shopping there unless it's absolutely necessary. Story 159. There's a community playground near me that's supposed to be a safe space for kids, but it's anything but. The slides and swings are rusted, and several of the bolts are loose. Last summer, a swing chain snapped while a child was on it, and they fell to the ground, luckily without serious injury. The ground is covered in gravel instead of soft padding, making it even more dangerous. Parents have been asking the city for repairs for years, but nothing has been done. Most families have stopped going, but it's sad to see such a valuable resource go to waste. Story 160. There's a warehouse near my neighborhood that's been turned into a flea market, but the building is in terrible shape. The roof leaks during every rainstorm, and vendors have to cover their boots with tarps to protect their goods. One time, part of the ceiling caved in, narrowly missing a vendor's table. The wiring is also a disaster. Exposed wires dangle from the ceiling, and I've seen sparks fly when vendors plug in their equipment. Despite the obvious safety hazards, the flea market remains open, attracting crowds every weekend. I've stopped going because it feels too dangerous. Edit. A lot of you are asking if insurance could help in these situations. While some businesses may have insurance, it often doesn't cover the full scope of repairs, and many owners choose to cut corners instead of fixing the root problems. It's frustrating to see safety take a back seat.